The war in Europe had entered a new and dangerous phase. The beaches of Normandy were far behind now, and the Allied armies pushed deeper into the heart of France with a momentum that startled even their own commanders. Town after town was liberated, German defenses cracked open like old armor, and the belief that the enemy would soon collapse spread like fire through the ranks. Victory felt closer than ever before. But there was a problem so serious, so fundamental, that it threatened to halt the entire Allied advance. It was not a lack of courage. It was not the number of tanks or men. It was something far more mundane. Something that did not roar like a Panther tank or fire like a machine gun. Yet it was the very lifeblood of modern war. Fuel. A tank without fuel was not a weapon, but a metal coffin. A truck without gasoline was not a supply vehicle, but a stranded promise. Airplanes, armored divisions, artillery, radios, generators, even stoves for cooking rations all needed fuel. The faster the Allied forces advanced, the farther they moved away from their supply ports in Normandy. The front line stretched further and further east, like a rubber band pulled tight to the point of snapping. Moving all that firepower across France required a staggering volume of supplies. Ammunition, spare parts, medical equipment, mountains of food to feed an army of millions. The numbers were terrifying. Every mile further the Allies marched made the challenge worse. The enemy wasn't destroying Allied armor. Distance was. German commanders understood that perfectly. They retreated not out of panic, but with cold strategy. The German high command believed that eventually the Americans and British would run out of gas, stranded among the French countryside, unable to move forward. If that happened, German armored divisions could counterattack and push them back toward the sea. The Germans waited like wolves in the night, confident that logistics would become their greatest ally. But something else was coming. Something they did not anticipate. Something built not from steel and fire, but from wheels, grit, and determination. The Red Ball Express. The plan was bold and unprecedented. Create a non-stop, around-the-clock convoy system dedicated solely to supplying the front. No distractions. No dilas. A river of trucks flowing without pause, delivering everything the U.S. Army needed to keep fighting. Dedicated routes cut through France like arteries from a beating industrial heart. Nearly 6,000 trucks would run day and night. Drivers would sleep little, if at all. Fuel depots would be positioned like stepping stones across liberated territory. Roads would become one-way highways, isolated for the exclusive use of these roaring lifelines. Every hour, every minute mattered. If they slowed, the advance slowed. If they stopped, the war stopped. But there was another truth hidden inside this effort. A truth the world often overlooked. Most of the men behind the wheel were African American. The U.S. Army at the time was still segregated, confining black soldiers mostly to support roles. Yet it was those same men who carried the responsibility of keeping Patton's spearhead moving. They belonged to transportation battalions trained to handle trucks not as vehicles but as instruments of victory. These soldiers were skilled, proud, determined to show a country that doubted them that they were indispensable. Their mission would become legendary. On August 25, 1944, just after the liberation of Paris, the Red Ball Express roared to life. Engines growled like restless beasts ready to run. Tires chewed through dirt and broken pavement. The thunder of thousands of motors rolled across France. From the ports near Normandy all the way to the advancing armies, the convoys stretched for miles. Their lives became a blur of motion. They lived behind steering wheels, gripping them until joints ached. They spoke in engine sounds and shifting gears. They drove through darkness with headlights blacked out to avoid enemy aircraft, navigating by tiny hood lamps that cast weak circles of light on the ground. Fatigue clawed at their minds. Danger stalked every road. Yet they drove on. Every truck carried more than cargo. Every truck carried the future of the war. And the Germans realized far too late what was happening. At first, German intelligence dismissed the convoys as a temporary boost in supply, a desperate attempt to outrun the limits of distance. They believed this level of effort could not be sustained. They believed industrial power had boundaries. They were wrong. American factories, thousands of miles away, roared with relentless productivity. Assembly lines clanged like war drums. Tires rolled off belts by the millions. Engines were built faster than they could be installed. Fuel refineries pumped out gasoline at rates the Axis could only dream of. The Red Ball Express was not a temporary fix. It was a declaration. Modern warfare would no longer be ruled by railroads, weather, or conquest. It would be ruled by those who could deliver. But victory seldom comes without cost. The roads in France were not designed for that kind of punishment. Each day, the convoys wore them thinner. Potholes grew into craters. Bridges creaked under constant strain. German saboteurs lurked in forests and villages, waiting to strike supply lines when least expected. Enemy fighters occasionally swooped from the sky, machine guns spitting fire at trucks below. A broken axle could be the difference between safety and death. Accidents were constant. Trucks veered into ditches. Tires exploded. Engines overheated. Drivers pushed themselves to stay awake, pinching their arms, singing loudly, slapping their cheeks. Some struggled to focus, seeing double in the blur of the road. There were nights when exhaustion took the wheel, and a truck drifted into catastrophe. Still, they kept going. The convoy became a moving testament to sacrifice. Men who rarely received praise risked everything to ensure that those on the front line had what they needed to survive. Patton's tanks were notorious for burning through fuel like raging animals. But thanks to the convoy, they never lacked for long. Every surge forward was enabled by men the enemy never saw. German command realized with growing horror that their plan had failed. They thought logistics would choke the Allies. Instead, logistics turned into a knife pressed against Germany's throat. The Americans did not simply transport supplies. They weaponized them. Where a German battalion might receive a few precious gallons of fuel, U.S. units received enough to move across entire countries. Where German vehicles sat abandoned for lack of gasoline, American columns stretched beyond the horizon. Where German soldiers starved, Americans ate. Where German guns grew silent, Allied artillery thundered. All because of trucks rolling tirelessly through the night. Meanwhile, the drivers themselves found ways to cope with the madness. They joked with each other, sang songs, swapped stories during quick refueling stops. Sometimes they laughed because the alternative was despair. They carved identities out of engine grease and courage. Many painted names on their trucks. Some added makeshift armor plates to protect themselves from gunfire. A few kept lucky tokens hanging from dashboards. Photos from home, prayer cards, small gifts from family. Anything that reminded them they were more than machines in motion. And though the army segregated them, reality blurred those divisions. White and black officers depended on each other. Supply clerks, mechanics, and dispatchers worked without pause because every delay meant danger. Commanders learned to trust the drivers who risked their lives on the road more than any map or projection could. Speed became salvation. A truck that arrived 1 hour late could cost lives. A truck that arrived early could save them. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies. Enough steel, fuel, and firepower to keep the front rolling unstoppably toward the German border. It was a logistical feat unmatched in history. Patton himself famously said that his army would be powerless without gasoline. And gasoline, he said, came from the heroes of the Red Ball Express. The men behind those wheels laughed when they heard that quote, though some felt a spark of pride. Respect was rare for them, recognition even rarer. But here was a general whose name echoed across newspapers and radios, admitting he relied on them. The drivers already knew. Every mile they conquered, every barrel of fuel they delivered, every bullet, every loaf of bread, every spare tank track that prevented an armored column from stopping forever, proved one truth. Wars are not won only by those who pull the trigger. Wars are won by those who deliver the ammunition. German generals watched their maps with mounting dread. The enemy supply line they expected to break only grew stronger. The idea that the Allies would starve or stall shattered like glass. The Germans had underestimated something far more powerful than tanks. They had underestimated the will to sustain victory. The Red Ball Express showed that food, fuel, and freedom could travel together. That logistics, once mocked as dull and unglamorous, were now the sharpest blade in modern war. As the convoys roared forward, a sense of inevitability spread across the continent. A whisper carried by the rumble of engines. Germany could not outfight an army that never stopped moving. And every soldier at the front knew who kept them moving. The ones behind the wheel. The Red Ball Express. Section 2. Night Convoy into the Unknown. Darkness was not the enemy on those French roads. It was the companion, the shroud that protected the convoys from overhead eyes hungry for targets. Headlights were banned. Only tiny slits of hooded lamps, like faint fireflies pinned to steel beasts, hinted at movement. The engines growled like a caged storm, one ready to lash out across Europe. The drivers gripped their steering wheels with hands roughened by diesel and fear. Many of them were African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, denied glory yet entrusted with the arteries that kept the entire Allied army alive. They were told, if the trucks stop, the tanks stop. And if the tanks stopped, the war stopped. Every mile they drove was a whispered promise to the soldiers at the front. Fuel for Patton's Sherman tanks. Ammunition for artillery that lit up the horizon with man-made thunder. Rations and medical supplies, hope packed in crates and canvas. Behind them, liberated villages still smoldered. Ahead, uncertainty waited like a coiled serpent. German commanders studied their maps, brows furrowed. Allied divisions were advancing faster than any logic allowed. Supply lines should have snapped like twine. Yet, every time they tried to predict when the Americans would finally run dry, fresh supplies arrived, as if conjured from thin air. No magic trick, no miracle. Just thousands of determined drivers and the unrelenting rhythm of engines that refused to rest. Each route was marked with a red dot, the old railroad symbol for priority passage. The men began calling themselves what the painted signs suggested. Red Ball. They drove with uniforms soaked in sweat, nerves taut as tripwires. Tires skidded through mud pits deep as graves. Sniper bullets sometimes stitched the darkness, unanswered and unseen. A single mistake could send a 2.5-ton truck tumbling into ravines black as spilled ink. Yet the column never stopped. The convoy was a steel serpent, a lifeline stretched across the wreckage of France, pulsing with fuel and food and the fierce will to keep moving. When they surged forward, the Allied advance surged with them. And every rumble of those engines whispered the same defiance. Logistics will not break us. Logistics will break you. Far ahead, German field marshals finally understood. This was no mere supply chain. It was a weapon, and it was coming for them at full throttle. Section 3. Fuel for Victory. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express was already rewriting the rules of modern warfare. Each day, more than 12,000 tons of supplies surged forward, like the heartbeat of a colossal war machine. Fuel became the blood that kept Patton's armored divisions sprinting across France faster than German generals could recalculate their maps. Gasoline drums, stacked like metallic beehives, clattered and rolled in the backs of the trucks. The drivers handled them with reverence and urgency. They knew a single spark could turn their vehicle into a flaming meteor careening through the dark. In their rearview mirrors, they could almost see the incredulity etched on the faces of the Wehrmacht commanders. The Allies were never supposed to move at this speed. Logistics, the Germans believed, would strangle any advance long before Paris was liberated. They trusted the tyranny of distance. The Red Ball Express turned that belief into a bitter joke. Patton, prowling the front like a restless predator, spoke with the brash confidence only he could wield. My men can eat their belts, but my tanks must have gas. And the Red Ball drivers delivered. Every single day. There was no room for weakness, no pause button. Breakdowns were repaired roadside, the way a cavalryman might mend his saddle mid-charge. Drivers leapt onto fenders, wrenched bolts loose, and coaxed coughing engines back to life with dirt-streaked hands and language that would make a chaplain blush. Their reward was not medals or headlines. Their reward was motion. Convoys stretched so far that tail trucks departed before the first trucks returned. It became a living loop of necessity, turning paved roads into conveyor belts of survival. Sometimes, fields on both sides of the route would flicker with tracer fire or erupt under artillery shells. The drivers were supposed to keep going. Swerving was safer than stopping. Fear was swallowed and digested quickly. They would look ahead, squinting into a moonless horizon, and find strength in the simple truth. The army keeps advancing because we do. At night, when engines finally cooled and tires sighed with relief, soldiers would sit on dusty bumpers and share cigarettes. Laughter drifted into the cool air, layered over exhaustion and pride. They did not know they were making history, but history certainly noticed them. Day and night blurred into a single, endless shift for the men of the Red Ball Express. Sleep was a rare luxury. Focus became a survival instinct. Their world narrowed into the hum of the engine, the rattle of cargo, and the ghostly shape of the next truck ahead. Two-lane French roads strained under the weight of war. They wound through villages, across rivers, and into forests where every shadow might hold danger. The speed limit? There wasn't one. You drove as fast as the truck could endure. Convoys surged forward like rivers with metal banks, headlights taped into narrow slits to avoid drawing enemy eyes. The drivers learned to navigate by the faint glow of the taillights before them. Felt like trying to follow fireflies through a storm. There were checkpoints, but no stops. Traffic lights? They were decorations now.
Civilian vehicles Katarat.
Bridges became sacred choke points where mistakes could ripple like explosions through the entire line. The Red Ball route had one rule: forward only. When a truck broke down beyond quick repair, it wasn't coddled or pitted. It was shoved aside. Mechanics would cannibalize it for parts while the convoy thundered past. Military police guarded the roads with fierce authority. A disoriented jeep or wandering tank column that accidentally entered the Red Ball route would find itself cut off and redirected quickly, sometimes at gunpoint. Nothing could be allowed to disrupt the flow. The Germans threw everything they could to stop this lifeline. Air attacks swooped down like steel hawks. Ambushes lurked in dense hedgerows. Mines hid beneath quiet soil, but the convoys kept rolling. Instinct sharpened into something nearly supernatural. A sudden flash, a staccato burst, the sharp whistle of a bullet skipping across a hood. And still they drove on, because every mile conquered meant fuel in Patton's tanks. Every delivered crate meant fewer Americans falling in the next battle. At the end of a shift, hands trembled not with fear anymore, but with raw fatigue. Sleep grabbed them the moment they sat down, like a merciful knockout punch. They rested on the ground, inside trucks, under trucks, legs dangling, boots still muddy. No one complained. They had become the artery of liberation, the heartbeat of speed, the highway that never slept, the race against empty tanks. Autumn crept into France with cold mornings that clung to the bones. The leaves turned color, but soldiers barely noticed. What mattered wasn't scenery. It was fuel. As Patton's armored divisions lunged toward the German border, every mile devoured gasoline like a wildfire consumes dry grass. Tank commanders watched their gauges with the same anxiety a drowning man watches his last breath escape. The German high command clung to one hope. If they couldn't smash the Allied armies, they might starve their momentum. Destroy bridges, blow up fuel depots, strafe the convoys, make logistics buckle. Because an army without supplies becomes just a very large crowd. But the Red Ball Express refused to buckle. So many trucks thundered across northern France that dust clouds rose like war-made weather fronts. Curious French villagers stood beside their shattered homes and stared, shocked by the sheer abundance roaring past. Children waved. Drivers waved back, sometimes tossing candy or gum out the window. Sweetness became diplomacy. Inside the cabs, the men focused on one mantra: keep the tanks moving. Occasionally, they'd reach Patton's forward fuel dumps to find his impatient tankers already waiting, engines rumbling like hungry beasts. The moment the trucks stopped, soldiers sprang forward, unloading drums with frantic precision. The air smelled of gasoline and victory, and then the trucks turned right around and roared back again. There was no finish line, only a revolving door of urgency. Fuel delivered today was burned tomorrow. The war's outcome flowed not from battle lines, but from supply lines that stretched and strained like overworked ligaments. Mechanics worked miracles in dirt and rain, stitching trucks back together with whatever they had. Tires shredded. Engines overheated. Gearboxes gave up the ghost. Some trucks returned looking more battered than soldiers who had survived the front. Yet replacements rolled in from behind like an endless tide. America's factories back home were pouring out trucks faster than Europe could destroy them. Even German POWs, captured along the route, watched in disbelief. This was not an army surviving war. This was an army consuming it. One German officer whispered with a mixture of awe and dread, "How do you defeat a nation that manufactures victory?" The Red Ball drivers never heard that line spoken, but they felt the meaning in every groaning axle and rattling chassis. Each delivery was another reminder that Germany's war machine was running on fumes. The United States was not about to run out. Not now. Not ever again. The war was shifting. Momentum was a living thing, and the Red Ball Express fed it until it grew unstoppable. Roads of courage, roads of fire. The Red Ball Express may have been a miracle of logistics, but it was also a gauntlet of danger. The road ahead didn't just test steel and gasoline. Tested courage. Enemy aircraft prowled the skies, hunting trucks like wolves track deer. The Luftwaffe, desperate and cornered, hurled what strength remained into strafing runs intended to bleed the road dry. A sudden shriek from above. A blinding dive. Machine gun fire tearing the air apart. Drivers hugged the steering wheel like a shield. Some swerved off the road, mud flying. Others pressed down harder on the accelerator, trusting speed more than fear. After the attack passed, they would wipe sweat from their brows and pretend their hands weren't shaking. But plenty of threats hid right on the road itself. Mines, disguised under innocent dirt. Booby-trapped bridges. Snipers lurking among blackened trees. Each turn of the wheel carried a question. Would this mile be the last? Yet duty turned fear into fuel. African-American drivers bore an even heavier weight. Fighting for a country that still segregated them, they drove without recognition, without equal treatment. But they drove with determination that no bullet could puncture. Some joked in the darkness, their laughter the spark that kept spirits alive. But even moments of tragedy were brief pauses in a relentless story. One man's loss couldn't be allowed to stop thousands of others. The trucks rolled on. When drivers did sleep, it was the kind of sleep that ended mid-dream with a whistle blowing. Up, load, let's go. No sunrise needed. No complaints allowed. Their reward? A simple truth whispered in tired pride. We're the reason the enemy keeps running. They didn't have medals pinned to their jackets. But every living soldier at the front was proof of their success. The night would fall again. Engines would cough and growl to life. And the Red Ball Express would once more take to the roads like a thunderstorm on wheels. Somewhere in the distance, the war still hungered. The drivers fed it. With courage. With grit. With miles. Autumn's chill had been just a warning. Winter arrived like a tyranny of ice. The Red Ball Express drivers felt it first in their knuckles, stiffening as they clung to the wheel. Breath fogged inside the cab, frost forming delicate patterns on glass that already rattled with every pothole. Roads that once roared now crackled under sheets of frozen rain. Snow fell like ash, swallowing tire tracks almost as soon as they formed. Visibility shrank to the length of a headlight's whisper. Still, they drove. Each convoy pushed deeper into a Europe refusing to surrender. The war was not finished. The German army was wounded but not broken. And Hitler was preparing a monstrous gamble beneath the tall, silent pines of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge. It struck like a fist in the dead of winter. American forces reeled under the surprise assault. Tanks and trucks froze in place. Supply lines shattered under the weight of chaos. If ever there was a moment when logistics might fail, this was it. Patton, never a man to watch history unfold without punching it first, swung his divisions north in one of the greatest maneuvers the U.S. Army had ever attempted. But even Patton's brilliance needed fuel. Food, ammunition, warm clothing for soldiers trembling in snow-filled foxholes. Everything, everywhere, all at once. So the Red Ball Express became more than a lifeline. It became a rescue. Convoys pushed forward despite blizzards thick enough to erase the world. Trucks skidded on ice, tires searching desperately for grip. Chains wrapped around wheels clattered like chains on a prisoner's ankles. But forward they dragged freedom inch by inch. Sometimes progress slowed to a crawl. 5 miles an hour. 3 miles an hour. Then a long pause while drivers shoveled snow just to keep the road visible. Exhaust smoke rose like campfire signals in a land where the cold wanted to kill anything that didn't move fast enough. German artillery turned white fields into volcanoes. The drivers didn't flinch. They just pressed harder on the throttle. For every explosion, a truck rolled through the smoke on the other side. Supplies reached embattled American troops just before desperation could take root. Frozen fingers wrapped around warm cans of food. Engines sputtered back to life with fresh fuel. Ammunition arrived before rifles fell silent. Hope arrived behind a steering wheel. More than once, soldiers at the front watched the convoys break through with tears streaming down faces red from cold and relief. In those moments, the drivers became heroes, not hidden supporters. The only thing faster than the trucks was the rumor spreading among German ranks. The Allies cannot be stopped. Not by weather. Not by steel. Not by a dying empire's last gamble. The Red Ball Express turned the Battle of the Bulge from disaster to defiance. Winter might have had claws, but America's supply chain had wheels. And wheels can climb mountains. Rolling toward the endgame. By early 1945, the thunder of retreat echoed through German lines. Cities once swollen with the pride of conquest now teetered on the edge of ruin. Bridges fell behind the Wehrmacht like closing doors. Roads clogged with refugees fleeing the wreckage of a collapsing empire. But one thing never slowed: the Red Ball Express. Convoys rolled deeper into territory that only months before had been painted bold black on enemy maps. Each crate unloaded, each gallon of gasoline delivered, was another shove against the staggering German war machine. Supplies were no longer just sustaining soldiers. They were accelerating history. Patton's tanks didn't creep. They lunged. The First and Third Armies marched with hunger for the finish. And behind their rush stood the drivers. Silent, uncelebrated, relentless. By now, routes stretched and twisted toward the Rhine River, Germany's last formidable natural barrier. Every inch advanced was fought with bullets, yes, but also with fuel and food and ammunition that showed up exactly when they were needed. Some roads ran beside burnt-out forests where trees stood like charred tombstones. Others wound past stunned German civilians staring at convoys that felt more like parades of inevitability. The Red Ball soldiers rarely saw the front for more than a moment. But the war clung to the trucks like dust. Shell holes cratered the roads. Bridges wore the scars of demolition attempts that had just barely failed. Drivers' boots tracked mud from country to country. Their engines echoed across borders. Their mission expanded. Deliver supplies not just for survival, but for finishing what began in Normandy. Even as German officers ordered desperate counterstrikes, morale within the Red Ball Express stayed fierce. They tasted the turning tide. Drivers leaned forward in their seats and felt something powerful in each rumbling mile. The end is coming. We are delivering it. Convoys rolled past German surrendering patrols, their white flags nothing more than curtains falling at the end of a tragic performance. Towns freed themselves with cheers that hit tired drivers like applause. Some of the men allowed themselves a rare grin. But the job wasn't done. Not yet. Not until Berlin itself felt the pressure of these wheels. Not until the war machine finally starved and sputtered into silence. Every truckload delivered became another brick in the wall closing around the Reich. The French countryside gave way to the industrial veins of Germany. Factories once roaring with Nazi ambition now stood silent, choked by destruction and surprise. They had been outproduced, outpaced, overwhelmed. Because the United States did not run out of trucks, or gasoline, or resolve. The message was unspoken, but undeniable. Germany's tanks never ran out of courage. But they ran out of fuel. Thanks to the drivers who never ran out of road. The last miles to triumph. Spring returned to Europe like a long-delayed apology. Green leaves fluttered where winter once clenched its icy fist. Streams that had frozen silent now rushed freely again. Flowers pushed through soil still bruised by tank tracks. Life refused to wait for the war to end. And neither did the Red Ball Express. The convoys no longer carried the same frantic urgency as the darkest days of the Bulge. But every run still mattered. Germany was collapsing, but a wounded beast is never harmless. Pockets of resistance fought with the desperation of men who could already hear the verdict. So the drivers stayed sharp. Eyes forward, hands gripping the wheel like destiny itself. They hauled the tools of final victory. Weapons and fuel that would ensure the Rhine crossings succeeded. Food for liberated citizens who, for the first time in years, tasted hope instead of rationed fear. Medical supplies destined for makeshift hospitals filled with wounded from battles that now felt like the war's final growl. As convoys entered German cities, they witnessed the empire built on intimidation now trembling in its own shadow. Streets cracked. Buildings collapsed into jagged skeletons. Shop signs hung tilted like they were embarrassed to still exist under a cause that had already died. Yet even here, people waved when the trucks passed. Freedom doesn't need translation. Drivers glimpsed the front at its most human. Soldiers sharing chocolate with starving children. Medics carrying the broken with care. Engineers building bridges faster than they toppled. And always, behind it all, the rumble of more trucks on the way. In quiet moments, the men allowed themselves to feel what they'd earned. Pride that didn't need a medal to shine. Satisfaction that hummed like a well-tuned engine. A belief that wheels, not just rifles, had crushed tyranny. Somewhere, in a distant office crowded with final battle maps, a general tapped a route he would never know was cleared by a 19-year-old driver with trembling hands. Somewhere, a German officer stared at his dwindling fuel reserves and understood that no strategy could overcome starvation. Somewhere, a convoy roared across a bridge just rebuilt by the sweat of men who refused to stop. The Red Ball Express had not been glamorous. It had not been celebrated. It had been necessary. And nothing in war is more powerful than necessity. Every truck that reached its destination was a victory. Every mile conquered was a promise kept. Soon the drivers would return home, stepping off the world's fastest highway into a world that hadn't witnessed their courage. They would fade into factories, farms, and futures unknown. But for now, victory waited just ahead. Close enough to taste. Close enough for an engine to carry. April 1945 arrived with the sound of surrender trembling in the air. German defenses cracked under pressure too heavy for any nation to bear. Hitler's armies, starved of fuel and hope, withdrew into silence and shadows. The Red Ball Express kept rolling until silence replaced artillery. Not a moment sooner. Convoys reached the Rhine, then crossed it, tires thudding over pontoon bridges built with speed born of triumph. The roar of engines became a soundtrack for the collapse of tyranny. Drivers watched as Allied flags rose over towns that once marched to the rhythm of swastikas. The war's end did not come with a single roar. It came with a quiet, exhausted breath. It is over. The trucks slowed. The convoys disbanded. Engines cooled for the first time in months. Soldiers climbed down from cabs and stretched their backs, suddenly aware of every ache they'd ignored while victory still depended on motion. Some laughed. Some cried. Some simply stared at the horizon, unsure what to do without a road demanding their courage. War heroes were welcomed with parades and piercing camera flashes, their names etched into newspapers and monuments. But the Red Ball drivers, many of them African-American men whose bravery had carried Allied momentum on weary wheels, stepped quietly back into the background. They returned to a nation still learning how to honor them, a nation their strength had helped save. Some found new jobs behind the same kind of wheel they had mastered across a war-torn continent. Others traded their uniforms for work clothes, engines for tools, convoys for ordinary commutes. But history remembered, not loudly at first, but truly. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of life to the front lines. It had proved that the power to feed, fuel, and supply an army could be as decisive as any weapon forged in fire. It had shown the world that courage is not always born in the trenches. Sometimes it sits behind a steering wheel. German commanders admitted, with the grudging respect of defeated strategists, that American logistics were unstoppable. You cannot outrun an army that never pauses. You cannot break an enemy that always has more. Victory rolled into Europe on the tires of the Red Ball Express. In the years that followed, the once-overlooked drivers finally began receiving recognition, medals, and the honor they had earned mile by mile. Their story joined the chronicles of ingenuity and resolve that define America's part in the Second World War. Today, when historians tell the tale of how Germany fell, they mention battles and generals. But listen closely, and beneath the explosions and orders you will hear something else. The low, steady hum of engines. The determined heartbeat of a truck. The rhythm of freedom on the move. Because behind every soldier who charges forward, there is someone delivering the strength that keeps him fighting. The Red Ball Express didn't just support the war, propelled victory, and long after the final convoy parked, those wheels kept turning in the story of a world rebuilt. On the power of men who refused to stop.